quiet archive record. Tonight, we're stepping into a slow unfolding. Settle in. Let the outside world dissolve and gently descend into tonight's world. In November of 1975, a young logger named Travis Walton disappeared near Snowflake, Arizona, after he and 6 co-workers reported a close encounter with a bright object in the woods. For 5 days, law enforcement and volunteers searched while the crew faced suspicion, failed, and later passed polygraph tests and intense public attention. Walton then reappeared alive, confused and frightened, saying he had been taken aboard a craft and subjected to medical procedures. What is confirmed is the timeline of a missing person report, the search effort, media involvement, and years of debate over tests, statements, and documentary records. What remains unconfirmed is the central claim of an abduction, which rests on witness testimony, later retellings, and interpretations that vary with time. Tonight, we go through the Travis Walton story. We will treat this like an evidence table, not a courtroom, not a stage, just a careful layout of what can be dated, what can be quoted, what can be checked, and what remains only a human claim. For orientation, the key dates are simple. The event is reported in early November 1975. The missing period is 5 days. The story then spreads through interviews, polygraph reports, books, and a film adaptation. Those later layers matter, but they are not the same as the first records. The setting is the high country of northern Arizona. Pine forests, ridges, shallow valleys, dark roads that can feel like tunnels at night. In 1975, logging crews worked long days, hauled timber, and watched the calendar because contracts and weather did not wait. When later arguments try to explain why a story might form, pressure, money, pride, fear, those arguments often begin with something simple. Being behind schedule can make ordinary decisions feel sharp. The central figures were not famous when this began. Travis Walton was in his early 20s. Mike Rogers ran the crew. 5 other men were in the truck that night and later became witnesses. Their names appear again and again in interviews, archives, and documentaries. Some of them have tried to avoid attention. Some have spoken often. All of them have lived with the fact that one night of work became a permanent label. Before the timeline, we set one rule, gently but firmly. Confirmed facts are anchored to records and close-in documentation. Police reports, contemporaneous statements, newspaper coverage, phone records when available, and the basic chronology that can be cross-checked. Claims are what people say happened. Memories, interpretations, inner scenes, and the story they believe explains the fear. Claims can be sincere. Claims can be false. Claims can shift as time passes and as retelling smooths the rough edges. The Travis Walton case has both tracks at once. There is a confirmed missing person report and search. There are confirmed polygraph examinations with mixed and disputed outcomes. There is confirmed media involvement and later commercial work. There is confirmed disagreement between skeptics and believers that has lasted decades. And there is an unconfirmed central claim, an abduction aboard a craft, which remains a claim because it cannot be independently verified in a way the broader world accepts. Now, slowly, we lay out the sequence most often cited. The date commonly given is November 5th, 1975. The crew had been working in the forest outside Snowflake. The location is described with small variations across sources, but the overall geography is consistent. Rural roads, timber work, late afternoon, fading into early night. The men drove together in a truck as they left the work area. Here is the first disputed zone, the sighting itself. In the witness accounts, the men saw a light in or above the trees. Some describe it as a glow at first, then an object. They drove closer. In the core narrative they later told, the light resolved into a bright, hovering craft, close enough to illuminate the forest and close enough to feel present, not distant. A documentary mind pauses here, not to dismiss, but to remember how night works. Depth cues collapse. A single light can float in the mind. Vehicle motion makes lights slide and sway. Reflection can mimic movement. A distant aircraft can appear stationary. A meteor can feel like something arriving. And the human nervous system, under fatigue and darkness, can turn uncertainty into certainty. But the witnesses did not describe a vague point. They described structure, proximity, and fear. Their accounts include the sensation of the light pouring into the trees. They described a moment when the truck stopped and the scene changed from passing glance to confrontation. Now we move to the central claim. In the story, as told by the witnesses, Travis Walton got out of the truck and moved toward the object. The others shouted at him to stop. Some accounts emphasize curiosity, some emphasize a kind of trance, and some emphasize youthful bravado. In the same story, a beam of light struck Walton, knocking him down or throwing him backward. The other men panicked, fled in the truck, then turned around and came back. And Walton was gone. That moment. The beam, the panic, the short flight, the return to emptiness, is the hinge of the entire legend. It is also the moment least accessible to independent confirmation. No widely accepted photographs, no widely accepted physical evidence that can be measured and reproduced. What exists is testimony, and testimony always lives inside people. What is confirmed is what followed in the human world. The men reported Walton missing. Law enforcement involvement began. Search and rescue efforts unfolded over the next days. People looked. That search and the public concern it created is the first hard anchor. We can confirm that a missing person case existed. We can confirm that people treated it as serious. We can confirm that the crew themselves became a focus of suspicion. Suspicion had obvious reasons. A group of men says their co-worker was taken by something strange. The story sounds like a cover. If a person is missing, investigators have to consider the simplest explanations first. Accident, violence, human concealment. In many accounts, authorities leaned toward the idea that the crew might be hiding a crime. The men felt pressure. The public watched. The story became louder than the forest where it began. This is the atmosphere in which polygraph tests entered the record. Polygraphs are often treated as lie detectors, but they are better described as stress recorders. They measure physiological signals that can correlate with deception and can also correlate with fear, anger, shame, confusion, or the sheer pressure of being accused. Different examiners can obtain different outcomes. Different question formats can shift results. Training and bias matter. A person can tell the truth and still show stress. A person can lie and remain calm. In this case, polygraph results were mixed and debated. Some early examinations were reported as failed or problematic for some members of the crew. Later examinations were reported as passed, sometimes with different examiners and under different conditions. Supporters point to passes as evidence of sincerity. Skeptics point to early failures, to methodological concerns, and to the general limits of the technique. So we say it plainly. Polygraphs in the Walton case are part of the history, but they do not settle the central claim. They do not prove an abduction. They do not prove a hoax. They show that the story interacted with an era that wanted machines to measure truth. As the days passed, Walton did not appear, and fear grew. 5 days is long enough for rumors to solidify. It is long enough for people to decide what they think happened. It is long enough for a family to pass through panic, anger, and exhaustion. Then, Walton returned. The return is documented in broad outline. He made contact. He was alive. He was shaken. Reports describe confusion and fear. There are references to weight loss and dehydration, but details vary across sources and retellings. What can be confirmed is simple. He was missing, and then he was found. And once he was back, the story moved to its second track. Walton described what he said happened during his absence. His account, in later interviews and in writing, includes waking in an unfamiliar setting, seeing non-human beings, experiencing restraint, and undergoing medical procedures. He described pain, instruments, and the sense of being examined. In many retellings, he described attempting to resist, experiencing disorientation, and later encountering beings that seemed more human in appearance. A documentary approach treats this with care. It does not call it ridiculous. It also does not call it confirmed. It recognizes a hard truth about human experience. People can sincerely report things that cannot be externally verified. People can also sincerely report things that are not literally true. Memory can be vivid. Trauma can distort. Culture can supply imagery. The Walton narrative arrived in a period when abduction motifs were already circulating. Earlier cases, including the widely publicized Hill case, had put certain images into the public mind. The light, the paralysis, the examination, the table, the beings. When motifs repeat, there are at least two broad interpretations. One says motifs repeat because a real phenomenon repeats. The other says motifs repeat because stories shape perception and recall. A careful listener keeps both possibilities open and keeps the word claim attached until evidence changes the label. Now, we widen out. Why would people fabricate a story like this? Skeptics point to possible motives: attention, money, book deals, speaking opportunities, and the pressure of a logging contract. They point to the way a dramatic narrative can move a person from ordinary life into a strange kind of fame. They also point to the possibility of covering something else. An accident, an argument, a crime. Supporters respond with a different set of considerations. The social cost of being mocked, the risk of legal scrutiny during a missing person investigation, the fact that multiple men would have to coordinate, and the long endurance of the basic outline across decades. But motive arguments in either direction are not proof. People do risky things for profit. People also tell the truth even when it costs them. And people can hold on to an interpretation because it becomes a pillar of identity. The documentary approach is to map possibilities without pretending a map is a verdict. Now, we return to details that can be dated. The missing person investigation generated paperwork and public statements. Newspaper coverage, especially local coverage, captured the story while it was fresh. Those early accounts matter because they show what was said before decades of retelling. They also show how quickly a narrative can form once the media arrives. Media pressure changes people. When a reporter asks for a clean story, the witness tries to provide one. When a producer wants drama, details become sharper. When a skeptical interviewer challenges inconsistencies, witnesses may become defensive, and defensiveness can be mistaken for deception or for sincerity depending on what the listener expects. So one quiet method is to compare early statements to later versions. In many human events, not just UFO stories, details drift. A person may remember the light as a certain color, then later as another. Distance estimates change. Time estimates change. The order of small events changes. That drift is not automatic proof of lying. It is also not automatic proof of truth. It is simply how memory behaves. Another method is to examine what would likely exist if certain claims were true. If the event involved a physical craft in close proximity, would there be traces in the environment? Burned vegetation, disturbed soil, measurable radiation, mechanical marks. If there were traces, were they documented at the time by neutral parties or later by advocates? If a person was held for days, where were they and who saw them? If a person experienced medical procedures, are there marks, scars, or medical findings that can be independently evaluated? In the Walton case, there have been claims of symptoms and marks, and there have been skeptical responses that such things are non-specific. There is no consensus physical artifact that resolves the story. Now, consider the truck witnesses. Multiple witnesses is the reason this case stands out, but multiple witnesses does not automatically equal a single objective truth. Groups can influence each other. People can align stories under pressure. People can also share a real perception and still interpret it differently. And if the group had any plan, a group can coordinate, especially if they are bound by work, friendship, or fear. The witnesses have sometimes been described as consistent and sometimes as contradictory. Over the years, there have been disputes between individuals, and there have been allegations that one person privately admitted a hoax. There have also been denials and claims that such allegations were misquoted or misunderstood. From the archive perspective, later hearsay is hard to weigh. The best evidence remains what is documented: recordings, transcripts, and contemporaneous notes. And even those are imperfect. Now, it helps to place the Walton story inside the broader history of American UFO culture. In the 1970s, UFO research groups, magazines, radio shows, and local investigators formed a lively ecosystem. Some investigators tried to be methodical. Some were believers first and researchers second. Some were skeptics looking to debunk. The public was fascinated. Films and books circulated imagery. When a case entered that ecosystem, it did not remain unchanged. It was interpreted, retold, and sometimes reshaped to fit the expectations of audiences. One important layer in this case is the film adaptation, Fire in the Sky. Films are stories, not records. Walton has said parts of the film were not accurate to his own claimed experience, especially the horror elements. Many people think they know the Walton case because they know the film. That confusion is common. A dramatization becomes the memory, and the record becomes a footnote. So we separate three streams: the confirmed chronology, the witness claims, and the dramatized or commercial narrative. Now, we walk the confirmed chronology again with quiet precision. A logging crew works in northern Arizona. On the evening commonly given as November 5th, 1975, the crew reports seeing an unusual light and describes an encounter. Travis Walton is reported missing. Authorities and volunteers search for several days. The crew faces suspicion and scrutiny. Polygraph tests occur with disputed outcomes. Walton returns alive after about 5 days. He reports an abduction. The story becomes national and then international news. Later, books and film amplify it. Even within that simple skeleton, there are smaller facts that matter because they show how the story moved through the world. One of those details is the way the return is often described. Many retellings mention a payphone, sometimes a phone booth, in a small town in the region, with Walton calling for help. The image has become iconic. A frightened young man using a public phone, voice shaking, trying to reach family. The exact particulars can vary in casual retelling, but what matters is that the return involved contact and verification. He did not simply wander into a living room as if nothing had happened. He re-entered the world through a call, through a request, through the machinery of community. Another detail is how quickly the return shifts the case from search to scrutiny. The moment a missing person is found alive, investigators ask different questions. They want location. They want timeline. They want whether there was a crime. They want to know whether the original report was false. They want to know whether any resources were wasted. So even if Walton returned to relief, he also returned to interrogation. And because the crew had already been under suspicion, the return did not end suspicion. In some ways, it intensified it. A missing man coming back with a strange story creates two competing instincts in officials and in the public. One instinct is compassion. The other is suspicion of manipulation. Then comes the medical layer. In most controversial cases, later arguments depend on what was recorded medically in the first hours and days. But the public often receives only fragments. Someone mentions dehydration. Someone mentions weight loss. Someone mentions shock. Without full records, those fragments become symbols. They are treated either as proof of captivity or as details that could fit many ordinary scenarios. A careful voice does not turn those fragments into certainty. It simply notes that immediate medical evaluation is a real part of the record, and that the existence of evaluation is not the same thing as a specific diagnosis that proves an extraordinary cause. Another detail is the immediate media wave. Once Walton returned, reporters had a complete arc: disappearance and return. They did not need to wait for resolution. The story could be published in full, with the strange claim as the hook that media wave matters because it locks in early versions of the story. It also matters because it begins the long process of feedback. Witnesses see their own words on paper, sometimes altered. They react, they correct, they repeat. The story becomes a loop, and that loop is not neutral. It pushes people toward clarity and drama. It makes rough, uncertain recollections feel unacceptable. It pressures people to choose firm statements, even when they are unsure. This is not specific to UFO cases. It is a general property of public storytelling. So when we say confirmed skeleton, we do not mean a cold list. We mean a living chain of events that placed real people into a spotlight and then kept the light on them. That is the confirmed skeleton. Now, we move along the claimed narrative without pretending it is confirmed. In Walton's account, the craft interior is described as clinical. He describes beings that are not human, and later beings that appear more human. He describes being handled, restrained, and examined. He describes confusion about time and an urgent desire to escape. Some versions include a struggle, a mask, and a loss of consciousness. The details vary across tellings, and the variations themselves become part of the debate. When skeptics analyze these details, they sometimes treat them as a collage of cultural motifs. When supporters listen, they hear authenticity in the emotion and the persistence of the story. An archive approach asks, what do we know about how extraordinary memories can form? We know that missing time experiences can occur without spacecraft. Sleep deprivation, stress, panic, and altered states can create gaps. We know that false memories can be constructed, especially when a person repeatedly imagines and recounts an event. We also know that trauma can produce intrusive scenes that feel like memories. And we know that sincere people can misattribute causes. We also know, equally, that human knowledge is incomplete. People can witness rare phenomena. Unknown does not automatically mean impossible, but unknown also does not automatically mean alien. So the archive stays calm and keeps the labels honest. Now, consider the 5-day gap. This is where the story becomes most emotionally magnetic. A person missing for days creates a vacuum, and vacuums attract explanation. If Walton was not abducted, then where was he? If he was hiding, why? If he was injured, who helped? If he was held, who held him? Each possibility carries its own moral weight, and that moral weight shapes how people argue. Some skeptical theories propose that Walton hid to stage a story, perhaps connected to money or contract pressures. Some propose that he was somewhere safe, assisted by someone, and then returned when a plan was ready. Supporters respond that hiding for 5 days under an intense search would be difficult, and that the costs would be high. There are also theories that keep the core sighting ambiguous. Perhaps there was a light and a panic, and Walton ran, got lost, got injured, and later re-emerged with a story that made sense of terror. In that kind of theory, the human event is real and frightening, and the later narrative is an attempt to organize it. No theory has achieved consensus. Now, polygraphs again, because they are often treated as the key. In public memory, the polygraph becomes a single headline: passed or failed. In reality, the record is layered. Who administered the test, what questions were used, whether the subject felt threatened, what the scoring method was, whether the examiner was independent, and whether the results were reported accurately. If you are half asleep listening to this in the dark, remember the simple truth. A polygraph does not tell you what happened in the woods. It tells you how a body responded to questions in a room. Now, another set of facts that can be discussed calmly is the social aftermath. After Walton returned, the men and their families lived inside a tension. Some embraced it, some regretted it. Books and appearances can create financial incentives, but they can also create obligations. Once a story becomes your name, leaving it behind can feel like erasing yourself. That does not prove deceit. It does explain persistence. The story also became a symbol in a larger cultural argument. For believers, it is often presented as strong because multiple witnesses were involved. For skeptics, it is often presented as a case study in how stories form, how media rewards drama, and how contradictory statements can exist inside a group. Symbols are powerful, and symbols can detach from evidence. So we keep coming back to what an evidence table can hold. The table can hold dates. The table can hold early news articles. The table can hold police involvement and the reality of a search. The table can hold the fact of Walton's return. The table can hold statements and transcripts. The table cannot hold a physical artifact that forces a conclusion. Now, we move through a few of the common points in the debate, not as arguments, but as features of the terrain. One feature is consistency. Supporters emphasize that the men have largely kept to the core outline: light, stop, beam, disappearance, return. Skeptics emphasize that smaller details have shifted and that some relationships have fractured. Both can be true at once. Human stories often keep the main shape while the edges change. Another feature is risk. Supporters point out that lying during a missing person investigation is dangerous and that the men faced suspicion. Skeptics respond that if a plan existed, it could be calculated, and that sensational stories can attract help and shift attention. Another feature is the timing of commercial involvement. If book deals and film rights arrive, skeptics see motive. Supporters see consequence, not cause. Again, motive is not proof, but it is part of understanding. Another feature is the psychology of extraordinary belief. Some people listen and feel certainty. Others listen and feel irritation. Those reactions often say as much about the listener as about the case. Now, because this is a quiet archive story, we also allow room for emotional truth without claiming factual truth. Imagine you are in a truck with co-workers, tired, leaving the forest. You see a light. Your brain tries to decide what it is. Someone stops. Someone gets out. Your heart climbs into your throat. Something happens that you cannot explain in the moment. You flee. You return. Your friend is gone. You go to the police. People look at you like you are a killer or a liar. Reporters show up. Your name becomes a headline. That emotional landscape is real, regardless of what the light was. And imagine you are the missing person. Whether you were abducted, injured, hiding, or confused, you come back into a world that has decided you are a symbol. You have to explain. Silence looks like guilt. A simple story looks weak. A strange story feels like the only way to match the strangeness of being gone. That psychological pressure is also real. Now, we keep the documentary stance, calm, careful, and honest about the gap between record and claim. When people ask, is this one of the most credible abduction cases? The archive answers in a different language. It is one of the most publicized cases where multiple witnesses reported a strange light and where a person was missing for several days and later claimed an abduction. Credible is not a number. It is a social judgment. When people ask, is it debunked? The archive answers the same way. It has been criticized, and there are skeptical explanations. But debunked also is not a number. It is a label people use when they feel the case is resolved for them. Now, what kind of evidence would move the case? If there were contemporaneous recordings that captured the moment, not later retellings, but actual audio or video from the scene, that would matter. If there were independently verified medical documentation close to the return that showed something specific and unusual with a clear causal connection, that would matter. If there were verifiable proof of Walton's location during the 5 days, credible witnesses, records, or physical evidence, that would matter. If there were a documented confession with corroboration, not a rumor, not an angry quote, but a confession supported by evidence that would matter. In the absence of such evidence, the case remains suspended. Now, we let the story settle into the broader question it always raises. When humans encounter uncertainty, we reach for narrative. Some narratives are cautious, some are grand. The Walton story, whichever way you interpret it, shows how a single night can become a long argument about reality itself. It also shows something more ordinary, how communities respond when the familiar breaks. Authorities try to restore order. Media tries to create a story. Friends try to protect each other. Outsiders try to decide whether to laugh or to believe. Now, we return once more to the clean separation. Confirmed. A disappearance and a return. Confirmed. A search, suspicion, and public scrutiny. Confirmed. Polygraph tests with disputed meaning. Confirmed. A later career of retellings through interviews, books, and film. Claimed. The closing counter details, the beam and the abduction. Claimed. The interior scenes and the procedures. Claimed. The identity and intent of the beings. And between confirmed and claimed, a wide, quiet space where certainty does not arrive. It is tempting, late at night, to fill that space with a single answer. Aliens, hoax, hallucination, misperception, conspiracy. The archive does not do that. It says, here is what the record can hold, and here is what people say, and the honest line between them is part of the story. Now, listen to the simplest version of this case, reduced to its bones. A working crew in a forest sees a light. A young man leaves the truck. Something happens that the others interpret as a strike of light. He is gone. The world searches. He returns. He tells a story that cannot be independently verified. The story becomes famous. The fame becomes its own force. And decades later, in the calm of a quiet room, we still do not know what happened in the trees. Now, before we drift to an ending, we can slow down and walk through the case with a little more texture. Not to inflate it, but to see how the pieces actually sit. Start with the road itself. In the accounts, the men were riding in a single truck after work, tired, in that particular tiredness where the mind is half on the dark and half on the warmth of home. Forest roads in that region can be narrow and uneven. The trees are tall enough to block the horizon. You see only what your headlights reveal and whatever glow exists beyond them. In the witness narratives, the first thing that appears is not a craft with bolts and panels. It is a light, a glow, a bright source that seems out of place against the natural darkness. And as they drive, the light seems to persist, to remain there, to become more defined. This is where a cautious listener holds two truths at once. A light in the woods can be ordinary. It can also be the beginning of something rare. The human mind decides quickly, sometimes too quickly. It builds an object from a fragment of information, and then the object feels real. In the claimed version, they stop. The stop matters because it transforms a passing stimulus into a chosen confrontation. A car or truck that keeps moving often prevents certainty. A vehicle that stops creates time, and time is where memory forms. Multiple witnesses later agree on the broad point that an unusual bright object was close enough to throw light into the trees. They use the language available to them. Disc, saucer, oval, something hovering. The details differ, but the gist is the same. Bright, close, not like an ordinary light. Then comes the decision that in hindsight, feels like destiny. Walton leaves the truck. If you have ever been in a group where fear is rising, you know how quickly roles appear. One person freezes, one person shouts, one person becomes curious, one person becomes the one who will later be blamed for everything. The Walton case, whatever it is, has that shape. The young man steps out. The others protest. The driver wants to leave, and the moment becomes irreversible. The beam is the vivid detail that locks the story into the abduction genre. A beam of light described as striking Walton, knocking him down, throwing him back. A beam is simple and symbolic. It is what people expect an advanced craft to do. It is also the kind of detail that can be created by intense light, glare, a stumble, an impact, a fall, and the brain trying to explain movement with a cause. The witnesses say they fled. That reaction is psychologically plausible. It is also the part skeptics highlight, because leaving and coming back creates a gap where anything could happen. How far did they go? How long were they gone? Did they truly return immediately? Or did the narrative compress time? Under stress, humans misjudge distance and duration in both directions. But again, what we can confirm is not the beam. It is that Walton was not with them afterward, and that they reported him missing. The report matters because it creates a timestamp. It anchors the story to institutions that keep records. When law enforcement becomes involved, the narrative stops being purely personal. It becomes a file. It becomes a chain of actions. Calls, interviews, search planning. Search and rescue is its own kind of story, and it is often overlooked. People walked through the woods. People called out names. People scanned for tracks, clothing, broken branches, anything. Those efforts are not exotic, but they are real. And the absence of a clear find is not proof of an abduction. But it does show that the ordinary explanations were not quickly resolved. During that period, suspicion fell on the crew. This too is psychologically expected. A missing person case often begins with the closest people. The last seen group becomes the first examined group. The story they offered was strange, and strangeness triggers suspicion. If your friend is gone, and you say a glowing object took him, some listeners will assume you are hiding something. Others will assume you are delusional. Either way, the men were pressed. Pressed people make mistakes. They speak too quickly. They contradict themselves. They over-explain. They under-explain. Their voices tighten. They become angry. All of that can look like guilt, even when it is simply stress. Polygraph examinations arrived inside that pressure. A quiet archive voice does not treat polygraphs as magical, but it also does not dismiss them as meaningless. They are a tool, and like many tools, they have a narrow use. They can sometimes detect whether a subject is responding with patterns consistent with deception, but they cannot tell you what truly happened. They also depend on examiner skill and fairness. In public discussions of this case, polygraphs become a kind of trophy. People cite them as if a pass is a stamp of cosmic truth, or a fail is a confession. In reality, the Walton case includes reports of failed examinations and later reported passes. That mixed record is not unusual in controversial cases. Different examiners, different framing, different subject conditions. The most honest thing to say is that polygraphs added heat to the case. They did not resolve it. Now, the 5-day absence. 5 days is enough time for a person to die. It is enough time for a person to hide. It is enough time for a person to be held, It is enough time for a person to be injured and wander. It is enough time for a person to be sheltered by someone. It is enough time for the imagination to generate 100 scenes. The archive can confirm that the absence happened. It cannot confirm the location. And that is why the debate never ends. The central question is not the light alone. The central question is the gap. If you can solve the gap, you can likely solve the case. If you cannot solve the gap, the case remains open in the cultural mind. Then Walton returns. The return is both relief and a new beginning. When a missing person comes back, the community wants the simplest answer. Where were you? Who did this? What happened? And if the answer is strange, the community splits. Some lean in, some recoil. Accounts of Walton's immediate condition vary, as they often do in stories retold through many mouths. But the broad outline is consistent. He was disoriented and frightened. He contacted people. He was medically evaluated. The story became news. Now we come to Walton's abduction claim. The archive treats the interior narrative carefully. It is a human report of an extraordinary event. It includes clinical imagery, a room, a table, instruments, beings. It includes the feeling of being processed, not spoken to, not comforted. It includes fear and confusion. Whether that imagery describes an external reality or an internal crisis, it carries a kind of emotional signature. Some listeners interpret that signature as authenticity. Others interpret it as a learned script. Both interpretations are possible. In the years after 1975, abduction narratives became a recognizable genre with repeated motifs. But it is important to remember that the genre did not appear from nowhere. It formed through case reports, media, and the human need to describe the unknown using available symbols. So the question is not simply, do the motifs match? The question is, what does matching mean? It could mean a shared phenomenon. It could mean shared culture. It could mean both. An unusual experience filtered through a cultural lens. Now, consider another difficulty. Even if something extraordinary happened, the accuracy of a recalled interior experience is not guaranteed. Trauma can scramble time. Disorientation can blur sequences. A person can remember a single moment and weave it into a longer narrative because the mind hates blankness. This is not an accusation. It is a description of human memory. Now, look at the witness group again, because group dynamics are often the quiet engine of cases like this. When several people share an experience, they talk about it. In the talking, they align. They correct each other. They persuade each other. They also, sometimes, argue. If one person insists on a detail, others may adopt it, not from deceit, but from the desire for coherence. At the same time, if a group truly witnessed something rare, the shared experience can bond them in a way outsiders cannot understand. That bond can look like collusion. It can also be genuine. Over time, relationships change. People drift apart. Old resentments surface. Business disputes occur. And in that shifting social field, statements can become weapons. One person can claim another admitted something. Another can deny. The public collects quotes like stones and throws them across decades. From the archive perspective, later interpersonal conflict is noisy evidence. It tells us that people are human. It does not tell us what happened in the woods and now. The role of investigators and researchers. Some UFO investigators approached the case with sympathy and belief. Some skeptics approached it with the goal of showing a hoax. The difference in approach shapes the selection of evidence. Believers may emphasize consistencies and emotional sincerity. Skeptics may emphasize contradictions, financial motives, and the absence of physical proof. Neither side is automatically right. Both sides can be biased. A documentary approach tries to borrow the useful methods from both. It borrows the believer's willingness to listen without ridicule. It borrows the skeptic's insistence on standards. Standards matter because extraordinary claims are easy to make and hard to verify. Now, we can also talk about the way the case moved from local event to national myth. In the first days, it is a missing person story with a strange overlay. Reporters show up because the narrative is unusual. Once the story enters the media, it becomes a signal for a larger audience that wants mystery. That audience, in turn, rewards certain kinds of telling: clean arcs, vivid details, dramatic moments. In that environment, nuance is the first casualty. A careful caveat, like "we do not know," does not sell as well as a confident claim. And so, over time, the loudest versions of the story become the most repeated. Then come the commercial layers: books, interviews, and eventually a film. The film layer is especially important because film becomes memory for people who were not there. Fire in the Sky created images that lodged in the public mind. Walton has said the film was not accurate to his account, especially in the intensity and cruelty of the procedure scenes. That disagreement itself is informative. It shows how a story can be taken from a witness and then reshaped into a product. A product is designed to evoke emotion, not to preserve a record. Now, if you have ever tried to reconstruct an event from conflicting accounts, you know the feeling. You hold a handful of statements. Some overlap, some diverge. You try to find the stable core. You try to identify what is likely to be distortion, but you never fully escape your own assumptions. In this case, the stable core, as the culture holds it, is simple: light, disappearance, return, abduction claim. The unstable edges include the exact nature of the light, the precise sequence at the roadside, the distances and durations, the fine details of the interior narrative, and the later statements made by participants under changing life circumstances. Now, we can place the Walton case beside other categories of explanation, gently. One category is misperception, an ordinary light misread, a panic response, a moment of confusion that becomes a story. Another category is fabrication, a planned hoax for money, attention, or to solve a practical problem. Another category is personal crisis, injury, disorientation, or psychological event that produces missing time and vivid imagery. Another category is unknown physical phenomenon, something rare or poorly understood that caused a real encounter, later interpreted through UFO language. And another category is the literal extraordinary claim, a non-human craft and an actual abduction. The archive does not collapse these into one. It notes that each has problems. Misperception alone does not easily explain 5 days. Fabrication alone requires a plan and coordination under pressure. Personal crisis alone does not easily explain multiple witness testimony of a close object, though it might if the object was misidentified. Unknown phenomena is a wide category that often becomes a placeholder for uncertainty. Literal abduction is extraordinary and therefore demands extraordinary support. Now, because this is a quiet, long telling, we can also slow down and imagine the day-by-day shape, not as fact, but as a way to understand why the case grips people. Day 1. a report of a strange light and a missing man. The forest is searched. Questions circle. The crew answers the same inquiries again and again, and each repetition changes the tone. Day 2. The search continues. Suspicion grows because the unusual story does not provide a body, a trail, a clear cause. The men become characters in a drama they cannot control. Day 3. The media begins to taste the story. The public begins to pick sides without evidence. Some people joke, some people fear, some people turn it into religion. Day 4. Fatigue arrives. Families are exhausted. The searchers are exhausted. The mind begins to accept that the outcome may be terrible. Day 5. The return, and the return is not a clean resolution, but an explosion of new questions. This is one reason the case never becomes quiet. It does not have a tidy ending. It has a continuation. Now, we can talk about the word evidence because it is often used loosely. Evidence is not simply a story you believe. Evidence is something that can be evaluated, something that can be cross-checked, something that can be weighed against alternative explanations. In this case, evidence includes documented dates, the existence of official involvement, the existence of search activity, and the existence of the later public record of interviews and publications. The strongest disputed evidence is testimony. Testimony can be evidence, but it is also vulnerable. It is vulnerable to memory distortion. It is vulnerable to group alignment. It is vulnerable to the desire for coherence. It is vulnerable to financial and social incentives. So the archive listens to testimony, but it keeps a space around it. Now, consider how people use the case in conversation. Some people cite it as proof that abductions happen. They emphasize multiple witnesses and the intensity of the story. Some people cite it as proof that hoaxes happen. They emphasize motives and inconsistencies. Some people cite it as proof that authorities cannot handle the strange. They emphasize mockery and disbelief. And some people cite it as proof that truth can be complicated, a mixture of misperception, fear, and later interpretation. The Walton case becomes a mirror. When you look into it, you often see your own relationship with uncertainty. Now, one more careful pass through the tools of evaluation, because this is where many listeners get lost. When you hear a case like this, your mind wants to do one of two things. It wants to accept, or it wants to reject. Acceptance gives you wonder. Rejection gives you safety. But investigation lives in a third space. The space where you keep questions open long enough to see what the evidence can actually support. The first tool is chronology. What is the earliest recorded description? What was said in the first days, before years of interviews and before the story acquired its most polished phrases? Early statements are not automatically more true, but they are less influenced by later narratives. The second tool is independence. Did witnesses describe details separately, or did they shape their statements together? How much did they talk before official interviews? How much did they share memory? Independence matters, because group memory is a real force. The third tool is incentives. Incentives do not prove deception, but they shape behavior. When a story becomes a livelihood, it can freeze into a fixed version. When a story becomes a source of ridicule, it can also freeze, because the teller feels cornered. The fourth tool is consistency with ordinary psychology. People under stress can misjudge time. They can fill gaps. They can become more certain with repetition. They can also avoid certain details because those details feel embarrassing. These are not signs of lying. They are signs of being human. The fifth tool is physical trace. If a claim implies a physical event, we look for physical residue. If the residue exists, we ask whether it was collected properly, documented properly, and evaluated by neutral eyes. If the residue does not exist, we do not conclude that nothing happened, but we adjust how strongly we can claim that something extraordinary happened. The sixth tool is alternative explanations. A story is not tested by finding one possible explanation. It is tested by comparing multiple explanations and seeing which requires the fewest unsupported assumptions. In the Walton case, believers often feel that a hoax requires too many assumptions, too much coordination, too much risk. Skeptics often feel that an abduction requires too many assumptions. Advanced beings, a craft, a hidden operation that leaves no decisive trace. Both sides are responding to the same core problem, the absence of a final anchor. Now, another quiet detail that matters is the difference between the public record and the private record. Public record includes interviews, published books, media appearances, and later documentaries. These are shaped for an audience. Private record would include contemporaneous notes, internal law enforcement documentation, and personal communications that might not have been intended as performance. When researchers do careful work, they try to locate the private record. When they cannot, they are forced to rely on the public record, which is always partially theatre. This is why the archive voice keeps saying the same phrase, confirmed and claimed. Now, it is also useful to acknowledge that some details many people think are solid are actually slippery. Even the phrase 5 days is a shorthand. The exact hours matter, and different tellings compress or expand time. The location of the return is often described with confidence, but in casual conversation, confidence can outrun documentation. This is not to undermine the case. It is to show how quickly stories become fixed in the mind, while the underlying paperwork remains complex. Now, consider what it means that the witnesses were ordinary working men. Some people treat that as a mark of credibility. They imagine that ordinary people are less likely to fabricate something elaborate, but ordinary people can fabricate and can also believe and can also misperceive. Other people treat ordinary background as a mark of innocence. They imagine that because the men were not trained storytellers, their emotion must be real. But emotion can accompany both truth and invention. The archive does not romanticize ordinariness. It simply notes that the men were human, under pressure, in a place where darkness and fatigue are not abstract. Now, consider another question that is often asked in a whisper. Why does this story persist? It persists partly because it has a clean arc, a confrontation, a disappearance, a return. It persists because it has multiple witnesses. It persists because it happened in a time when UFO stories were already popular enough to be recognized, but not yet so saturated that every claim was immediately buried under internet noise. It persists because it was amplified by books and by film. And it persists because it is unresolved. Unresolved stories live longer than resolved ones. Now, for the listener who wants a single sentence answer, the archive offers a sentence that does not pretend to be more than it is. The Travis Walton case is a documented disappearance and return that became permanently entangled with an extraordinary claim that remains unconfirmed. Now, what kind of calm conclusion can a documentary voice offer? It can offer the honest boundaries. It can say, there was a disappearance. That is real. It can say, the search happened. That is real. It can say, the crew experienced suspicion and underwent polygraph testing. That is real. It can say, Walton returned and made a claim of abduction. That is real as a claim. It can also say, the central extraordinary claim remains unconfirmed, and there is no widely accepted physical proof that forces the world to agree on a non-human explanation. And that is not disrespectful. It is simply accurate. Now, we can also hold compassion without surrendering standards. If the witnesses are truthful, then they have carried a heavy burden, ridicule, doubt, and decades of being questioned. If the story is false or partly constructed, then it also reveals something human: the desperation to be believed, the temptation to create meaning, the way a community can reward a story until the story becomes a cage. Either way, the case is about people as much as it is about lights. And because it is about people, the ethics of how we speak about it matters. It is easy to turn witnesses into cartoons, to call them saints or liars, to treat them as props in a debate about what you already believe. The archive tries to do something smaller and more respectful. It tries to let them remain human. That means we acknowledge that the crew may have experienced something genuinely startling, even if the later explanation is wrong. It means we acknowledge that Walton may have experienced something that felt like captivity and procedure, even if the cause is not extraterrestrial. It also means we acknowledge the possibility of deliberate construction without turning it into moral theater. Humans sometimes build stories under pressure, and sometimes those stories harden into a life. If you have never been interrogated, never been suspected, never had your words recorded and replayed, it is hard to understand how that changes a person. Under that kind of scrutiny, people begin to choose language that will survive. They avoid uncertainty because uncertainty is attacked. They repeat the same phrasing because variation is treated as contradiction. Over time, they learn to sound consistent. So when you hear a witness sound rehearsed, it can mean many things. It can mean deception. It can mean survival. And when you hear a witness sound messy, it can mean many things. It can mean confusion. It can mean honesty under stress. The archive keeps that ambiguity in view. Now, in calm documentary terms, we can ask what the case can teach, even if it never resolves. It teaches that missing person events create narrative pressure. It teaches that public fascination can turn a private crisis into a public symbol. It teaches that tools like polygraphs, which sound scientific in headlines, often function more like social rituals, ways for institutions and communities to feel they are doing something about uncertainty. It teaches that a single adaptation, like a film, can replace a record in the public mind. And it teaches that when a story becomes famous, it becomes self-sustaining. The story generates interviews. Interviews generate more story. And eventually, the story is no longer only about a night in the forest. It is about the decades that followed. Now, we also acknowledge the quiet possibility that in the end, the Walton case may be a mixture. A real light, perhaps misidentified, a real panic, a real disappearance with a mundane cause, and a later narrative that fused fear, memory, and cultural imagery into a coherent account. Mixtures are common in human life, but they are unpopular in debate. People want pure answers. They want hoax or aliens. They want to cheer or to laugh. But the archive is comfortable with mixture because mixture is often where reality lives. Now, one last note about what you can do as a listener if you ever choose to explore the case beyond this quiet telling. Seek primary sources when you can. Contemporaneous articles, contemporaneous statements, and recorded interviews close to the time. Be cautious with quotes that appear without context. Notice when someone is citing a citation, and always keep track of what is confirmed and what is repeated. If you do that, you can watch the case change shape as it passes through time. You can see which details are stable. You can see which details are added later. And you can see how your own expectations pull you toward belief or skepticism. Now, listen again to the simplest bones of the case and feel how little and how much it contains. A working crew in a forest sees a light. A young man leaves the truck. Something happens that the others interpret as a strike of light. He is gone. The world searches. He returns. He tells a story that cannot be independently verified. The story becomes famous. The fame becomes its own force. And decades later, in the calm of a quiet room, we still do not know what happened in the trees. Now, one last careful thought experiment, because it helps the mind understand why the case stays open. Imagine two futures. In the first future, a definitive, ordinary explanation emerges. Perhaps a document appears, or a credible witness places Walton somewhere specific during the gap, or a piece of physical evidence is located and verified. In that future, the story does not become meaningless. It becomes a lesson in how fear, pressure, and narrative can transform an event into a legend. It becomes a lesson in how communities and media can amplify an interpretation until it feels inevitable. In the second future, a definitive, extraordinary explanation emerges. Perhaps multiple independent cases converge on a single, testable physical reality. Perhaps evidence appears that is not merely persuasive, but measurable. In that future, the Walton case becomes one chapter in a larger history, and the arguments about motives and memory become secondary to a new baseline of what the world accepts. Right now, we do not live in either future. We live in the present record, where neither kind of anchor has arrived. And that is why the right posture is modesty. Modesty does not mean indifference. It means speaking in proportion to what we actually have. It means admitting what we cannot know from this distance. It means resisting the temptation to punish people for ambiguity by forcing them into the roles of hero or liar. If you lean toward belief, modesty asks you to remember that powerful story is not the same thing as proof. If you lean toward skepticism, modesty asks you to remember that ridicule is not an argument, and that people can be sincere even when they are mistaken. In the Walton case, the most honest sentence may be the least satisfying one. Something happened, a man was missing, and the explanation remains disputed. Now, as we drift toward an ending, we hold one more idea gently. Uncertainty is not a failure of the mind. It is sometimes the most accurate state a mind can hold. It can feel unsatisfying, but it can also be restful. You do not have to solve the case to understand it. You can simply see it clearly. A confirmed disappearance and return, wrapped around an unconfirmed claim, echoed for decades. And you can also notice what the case does to time. The farther we move from 1975, the more the story is made of story. The forest recedes, the paperwork fades, the people age, the cameras and microphones remain. Memory becomes smoother, certainty becomes easier to perform. And yet, the core unknown stays in the same place, like a stone that does not dissolve. So tonight, we do not declare a verdict. We acknowledge the people, the fear, the pressure, the attention, the years of being asked the same questions. We acknowledge the record, the dates, the search, the tests, the interviews, the way the story moved through media. And we acknowledge the gap, the space where the extraordinary claim remains a claim. In that gap, you can set down the need to argue. You can let the case be what it is in the archive, an event with a documented outline and an undetermined center. You can allow the possibility that the witnesses were sincere and still mistaken. You can allow the possibility that something rare happened and still accept that the record does not prove it. You can allow complexity, and you can let complexity be quiet. And if you ever feel the urge to force a conclusion, you can return to the simplest discipline. Say what is confirmed, say what is claimed, and then let the mind rest, like a room after voices have gone, slowly, gently, without strain. And you do not need to decide tonight. Let the forest go dark again. Let the truck lights fade. Let the debate soften into distance. This was a quiet archive story, where the story ends, sleep begins.